Flight attendant demands black pilot move from first class. Then he receives an urgent call to the cockpit. Elijah Carter dragged his carry-on through the jet bridge, his shoulders heavy after 3 back-to-back flights from Tokyo to Dubai to London. The familiar smell of airplane cabin wrapped around him as he stepped onto the aircraft, but this time something felt different. For once, he wasn't wearing his crisp pilot's uniform with the 4 stripes on the shoulders. Instead, he had on his favorite worn jeans and a comfortable navy sweater that his daughter had given him last Christmas. 2A, just on your right, sir, the flight attendant at the door said with a practiced smile. Elijah nodded, trying not to show his excitement. First class. It had been years since he'd sat up here as a passenger, usually spending his flights in the cockpit or occasionally in economy when traveling for leisure. But today, thanks to his accumulated miles and a streak of luck with upgrades, he was treating himself. The leather seat felt different from this side. Wider, more inviting. Elijah stowed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled in, the tension in his back already starting to ease. He pulled out his dog-eared copy of The Shadow of the Wind, a book his wife had been begging him to read for months, and placed it on the wide armrest. A businessman in an expensive suit glanced over from across the aisle, doing a double take that Elijah pretended not to notice. He was used to it by now, the looks, the subtle shifts in expression. 20 years of flying commercial had taught him that some things changed slower than others. The older woman in 2C kept stealing glances too, her pearls clicking softly as she turned her head, probably wondering what someone like him was doing in first class. Elijah pulled out his phone, sending a quick text to his wife, Sarah. On board. First class is nice. Might get spoiled. He smiled at her immediate response. About time. Don't forget to get those warm nuts they serve. Worth every mile we saved. The cabin slowly filled with the usual pre-flight shuffle, the squeak of shoes, the thump of bags being stored, the murmur of conversations about connecting flights and weather delays. Elijah took a deep breath, savoring the rare moment of being on this side of the journey. No flight plans to review, no weather patterns to monitor, no crew to brief. Just 6 hours of peace between him and New York. He watched as other first-class passengers settled in around him. A young tech entrepreneur type, with expensive headphones in 1A, tapping away at a MacBook. An elderly couple in 3D and 3F, clearly experienced travelers who had their pre-flight routine down to a science. The businessman across the aisle had already pulled out a stack of reports, his Mont Blanc pen poised for action. As the last few passengers trickled in, Elijah opened his book, running his finger along the worn spine. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, creating that intimate atmosphere that made first class feel like a world of its own. He could hear the muffled conversations from economy class behind him, the familiar symphony of a plane preparing for departure. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight drinks. "Welcome aboard," she said, reaching his row. "Would you care for water, orange juice, or champagne?" "Water would be great, thanks," Elijah replied, noticing how she seemed slightly surprised by his polite, well-spoken manner. Another thing he was used to, people's expectations versus reality. The cool glass of water appeared moments later on his armrest, condensation already beginning to form on its surface. Elijah took a sip, remembering countless times he'd been on the other side of this interaction, stopping by first class to chat with crew members during smooth flights. He pulled out the safety card from the seat pocket, a habit he couldn't break even as a passenger. 20 years of pre-flight checks had ingrained certain behaviors. The businessman across the aisle noticed this and smiled, probably thinking he was a nervous flyer. If he only knew. Through the window, Elijah could see the ground crew finishing their tasks, their orange vests bright against the gray tarmac. A luggage train snaked past, cargo holds being filled for the journey ahead. He watched with a professional eye, appreciating the choreographed dance of airport operations from this new angle. The cabin continued to buzz with pre-flight energy. A mother and her young daughter walked past on their way to economy, the little girl waving at everyone she passed. Elijah waved back, earning a giggle and a shy smile. These small moments, the human connections that happened at 35,000 feet, were what he loved most about aviation, whether he was flying the plane or just along for the ride. He checked his watch, still 30 minutes until departure. The book beckoned, and he finally allowed himself to sink into the story, the familiar sounds of the aircraft preparing for takeoff fading into a comfortable background hum. The seat truly was comfortable, he had to admit. Maybe Sarah was right about using those miles more often. The safety demonstration would begin soon, and Elijah found himself looking forward to experiencing it from this perspective. It was like being on the other side of a mirror, seeing his everyday world from a completely different angle. He took another sip of water, adjusted his seat slightly, and let himself relax into the role of passenger. For now, he was just another traveler, heading home after a long time away. Rachel Thompson had been flying this route for 6 years, and she prided herself on knowing her first-class cabin like the back of her hand. She could spot an upgrade passenger from a mile away. They were usually the ones taking photos of their champagne or awkwardly fumbling with the seat controls. But something about 2A caught her attention differently today. She'd been watching him since boarding, trying to put her finger on what fell off. He was quiet, reading his book, nothing unusual there. But he didn't have the usual look of a first-class regular. No designer watch, no AirPods, no expensive briefcase. Just a well-worn paperback and a simple carry-on. "Sorry to bother you," Rachel said, approaching his seat with what she hoped was a professional smile. "Could I just take a quick look at your boarding pass?" Elijah looked up from his book, his expression calm but slightly tired. He reached for the pass tucked into his seat pocket without comment. Rachel noticed his hands, strong, steady, with a plain gold wedding band. No flashy jewelry or status symbols that she usually saw in first class. "Just want to make sure everything's in order," she added, taking the boarding pass. Her eyes scanned the document. Seat 2A, sure enough. But something still nagged at her. "Did you receive an upgrade today?" A few nearby passengers had stopped their conversations, watching the interaction with poorly disguised interest. The businessman across the aisle had put down his reports, and the woman in pearls was practically leaning into the aisle to listen. "No, Elijah replied quietly. I purchased the seat." His voice was steady, with a hint of something Rachel couldn't quite place. Resignation? Frustration? She'd seen enough angry passengers to know this wasn't quite that. "It's just that sometimes there are mix-ups with seat assignments," Rachel pressed on, even as a small voice in her head told her to stop. "Are you sure you're not meant to be in economy? We could check dash." The elderly couple in row 3 exchanged glances. The wife whispered something to her husband, shaking her head slightly. The tech guy in 1A had removed his headphones, suddenly very interested in what was happening behind him. "I'm sure," Elijah responded, his tone remaining level, but with a firmness that hadn't been there before. "I fly this route often." He didn't elaborate, didn't mention his profession or status. He simply held Rachel's gaze, waiting. Rachel felt heat creeping up her neck. The boarding pass was legitimate, she knew it was. But something kept pushing her forward, some deeply ingrained instinct she hadn't even realized she possessed. "It's just that we've had issues with incorrect seat assignments before and dash. Is there a problem here?" The new voice belonged to Laura Chin, the head flight attendant. She'd appeared at Rachel's elbow, probably drawn by the growing tension in the first-class cabin. Laura's expression was neutral, but her eyes darted between Rachel and Elijah with growing concern. "I was just double-checking the passenger's seat assignment," Rachel said, suddenly aware of how this must look. The boarding pass felt heavy in her hands, like evidence of something she didn't want to acknowledge. The tech guy in 1A had fully turned around now, not even pretending to work anymore. The businessman across the aisle was frowning, his expensive pen tapping against his armrest in an irregular rhythm. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from pre-flight excitement to uncomfortable tension. Elijah remained still, his book open but forgotten on his lap. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He just sat there, radiating a kind of dignity that made Rachel's questions seem smaller and pettier with each passing second. "His boarding pass clearly shows seat 2A, Laura said quietly, glancing at the document in Rachel's hands. "Is there any specific reason for concern?" Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she say? That he didn't look like he belonged? That something felt off? Every possible response dried up in her throat as she realized what she was doing, what she had been doing from the moment she'd spotted him. The air conditioning hummed overhead, pushing cool air into the increasingly warm cabin. Someone coughed awkwardly. The little girl who had passed by earlier peeked through the curtain from economy, curious about the unusual quiet in first class. "I apologize for the confusion," Rachel finally managed, handing the boarding pass back to Elijah. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she hoped no one noticed. "Everything appears to be in order." Before Elijah could respond to Rachel's apology, Laura's phone buzzed with the distinct pattern that indicated a message from the cockpit. She glanced at the screen, her professional expression shifting to one of concern. Without hesitation, she leaned down close to Elijah's seat. "Mr. Carter," she said in a low voice, "I apologize for interrupting, but we need you in the cockpit immediately." The change in Elijah's demeanor was instant. The calm, patient man who had weathered Rachel's questioning disappeared, replaced by someone entirely different. He closed his book without marking his page and was on his feet in one smooth motion. Rachel stepped back, confused by the sudden shift. She watched as Laura and Elijah moved quickly toward the front of the plane, their shoes making soft sounds on the carpet. The other passengers were just as puzzled. The tech guy had half risen from his seat to see better, and the elderly couple were whispering rapidly to each other. "Is everything okay?" The businessman across the aisle called out, but neither Laura nor Elijah stopped to answer. Through the open cockpit door, Rachel caught glimpses of movement. The co-pilot emerged, looking pale and unsteady on his feet. Two flight attendants quickly helped him toward the galley, speaking in hushed tones about medical assistance. The captain's voice carried faintly through the cabin, technical terms and quick instructions that made little sense to most of the listeners. But Elijah understood every word. He stood in the cockpit doorway, asking precise questions about flight conditions and fuel levels, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone who had done this countless times before. The casual sweater and jeans suddenly looked different on him, less out of place and more like the temporary disguise they were. "Ladies and gentlemen," Laura announced, returning to the cabin, "we have a slight delay in our departure. Please remain seated." She paused, then added, "Everything is under control." Rachel stood frozen by the galley, watching as Elijah disappeared into the cockpit, sliding into the co-pilot's seat with practiced ease. The captain's voice became more relaxed, professional jargon flowing between them like a familiar language. The two men moved through pre-flight checks with the synchronization of longtime colleagues, though they'd just met. The realization hit the first-class cabin in waves. The businessman was the first to piece it together, a smile of understanding crossing his face. The elderly woman touched her pearls, shaking her head with what looked like embarrassment. The tech guy in 1A had already pulled out his phone, probably searching for information about off-duty pilots and emergency procedures. Rachel felt the weight of her earlier actions settle heavily on her shoulders. She watched through the cockpit door as Elijah adjusted his seat, checked his instruments, and spoke into his headset, all with the casual confidence of someone who had done it thousands of times. Which, of course, he had. The passengers who had witnessed her earlier questioning now avoided eye contact. A flight attendant rushed past with a glass of water for the ill co-pilot, who was resting in the crew area. The normal pre-flight bustle continued around them, but it felt different now, charged with a new awareness. Laura approached Rachel, speaking quietly but firmly. "Elijah Carter is one of our senior pilots. He's been with the airline for almost 20 years, mainly on international routes." She paused, letting the information sink in. "He's going to get us to New York safely, just like he's done hundreds of times before." The rest of the crew moved around them, preparing for the delayed departure. Through it all, Elijah's voice came clearly from the cockpit, calm and professional as he communicated with the tower. He showed no sign that anything unusual had happened in the cabin just minutes before. A young flight attendant who hadn't witnessed the earlier scene rushed up to Rachel with a clipboard. "Did you know we have an off-duty pilot in first class today? Talk about lucky." She beamed, completely unaware of the tension still lingering in the air. Rachel managed a weak smile, watching as the cockpit door remained open for the final preparations. Elijah was explaining something to the captain, pointing at one of the instruments with the easy familiarity of an expert. His book lay forgotten on seat 2A, a bookmark now carefully placed between its pages by one of the attentive flight attendants. The businessman had returned to his reports, but now he kept glancing toward the cockpit with what looked like respect. The elderly couple had settled back into their seats, but their earlier whispers had been replaced by knowing looks. Even the tech guy had put his headphones back on, though his screen remained dark. The cockpit felt like home to Elijah, even in an unfamiliar aircraft. Captain Mike Stevens, a man with graying temples and steady hands, ran through the pre-flight checklist with him as if they'd been flying together for years. BP's dropping, that's why he felt dizzy, Mike explained, referring to their original co-pilot. Medical's checking him out now. Thanks for stepping in, Elijah. Wasn't exactly how you planned to spend your day off, huh? Elijah adjusted his headset, fingers moving automatically over the familiar controls. Rather be up here than explaining to my wife why her favorite pilot got stranded in Chicago. His voice was light, but his eyes were focused on the instruments, already planning their route. Through the open cockpit door, he could hear the muffled sounds of passengers settling back into their routines. The earlier tension was dissolving into the normal pre-flight atmosphere, though he caught occasional whispers about what had happened. Weather looks clear to New York, Mike said, pulling up the radar. Might catch some turbulence over Pennsylvania, but nothing major. He paused, then added with a slight smile. Probably smoother than what you just went through back there. Elijah shook his head, running through the engine startup sequence. Not my first rodeo, Mike. Won't be the last either. He kept his voice neutral, professional. This wasn't the time to unpack what had happened in first class. Right now, they had 162 passengers counting on them for a safe flight to New York. Laura appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. Medical team says James is stable, but definitely not fit to fly. They're taking him to get checked out. She looked at Elijah. We've updated the flight manifest to show you as co-pilot. Operations has been notified. The radio crackled with ground control's voice, and Elijah responded automatically, his words clear and precise. He could feel the subtle vibrations as the engines came to life, the familiar surge of power that never got old, even after thousands of flights. The cabin crew began their safety demonstration, their voices carrying faintly into the cockpit. Elijah and Mike worked in comfortable silence, each movement purposeful and coordinated. The queue for takeoff was shorter than usual. Sometimes, luck was on their side. You fly the Tokyo route regularly? Mike asked as they taxied toward the runway. Both men knew it was more than casual conversation. They were establishing trust, getting a feel for each other's experience. 3 years on Pacific routes, Elijah replied, checking their heading. Before that, mostly European corridors. Started with regional flights out of Atlanta. He smiled slightly. Back when these electronics were all analog. Mike laughed, the sound genuine and warm. You and me both, brother. Remember the old stack controls? Kids these days don't know how good they've got it. The easy rhythm of their conversation was interrupted by ground control clearing them for takeoff. Elijah felt the familiar surge of anticipation as they lined up on the runway. This was the moment he loved most, the perfect balance of power and precision, technology and human skill. The engines roared to life, pushing them down the runway. Elijah called out speeds with practiced ease, his voice steady and clear. V1 rotate. The nose lifted smoothly, and Chicago fell away beneath them, the afternoon sun glinting off Lake Michigan in the distance. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Elijah could feel the aircraft settling into its cruise configuration. The autopilot engaged with a soft beep, but both pilots kept their hands near the controls. Old habits died hard. Nice and smooth, Mike commented, adjusting their heading slightly. You've got a good touch. Shame you're not on this route more often. Elijah nodded, thinking of his book still sitting in seat 2A. Might be seeing more of domestic routes soon. Daughter's starting college in the fall. Thinking it's time to stay closer to home. The conversation flowed easily between them as they monitored their instruments, two professionals sharing the comfortable space of the cockpit. Below them, passengers were probably starting to relax, ordering drinks, pulling out laptops or movies. The first-class cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet. Rachel moved through her service routine mechanically, pouring drinks and distributing warm nuts with practiced efficiency. But her movements lacked their usual confidence, and she avoided making eye contact with the passengers who had witnessed her earlier confrontation with Elijah. "Everything's running smoothly now," she overheard Laura telling a curious passenger. "Captain Stevens and Mr. Carter are an excellent team." The word stung, a reminder of how quickly she had jumped to conclusions about a man who is now partly responsible for everyone's safety. The tech guy in 1A had finally returned to his laptop, but his headphones hung around his neck instead of over his ears. He seemed more interested in the occasional snippets of conversation from the cockpit than whatever was on his screen. The businessman who had watched the whole scene unfold was on his third scotch, though they were barely an hour into the flight. Through the open cockpit door, Elijah's voice carried clearly as he communicated with air traffic control. His tone was confident, professional, no trace of the man who had quietly endured Rachel's questioning. She found herself pausing near the galley, listening to the easy back and forth between him and Captain Stevens. "More water?" the elderly woman in pearls asked, catching Rachel off guard. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes held a knowing look that made Rachel's cheeks burn. It must be quite warm, working in this cabin. "Yes, thank you," Rachel managed, pouring water with slightly shaking hands. The ice cubes clinked against the glass, somehow louder than usual in the quiet cabin. A few seats away, the businessman pretended to be absorbed in his reports, but she could feel his awareness of her discomfort. The seatbelt sign had been off for nearly an hour, and passengers in economy were starting to move about the cabin. Some paused near first class, trying to peek into the cockpit, curious about the mid-flight crew change they'd heard about through whispered conversations and text messages. Laura kept a careful eye on Rachel throughout the service, stepping in occasionally to handle requests from passengers who seemed hesitant to interact with her. The help was both a relief and a subtle reprimand, a reminder that Rachel's actions hadn't gone unnoticed by her supervisors. "Did you know he's flown for us for 20 years? One flight attendant whispered to another during a quiet moment in the galley. "My friend Jenny flew with him last month on the Tokyo route. Says he's one of the best." Each piece of information about Elijah felt like a small weight added to Rachel's conscience. She watched as his book sat untouched in seat 2A, wondering what he'd been reading, what kind of man he was beyond the snap judgments she'd made. The flight tracker on the screen showed them cruising somewhere over Michigan. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, creating patches of warmth on the empty seat where Elijah should have been relaxing. Instead, he was in the cockpit, doing the job he'd done countless times before. "More ice, sir?" Rachel asked the businessman, who had been nursing his drink for the past 20 minutes. "No, thank you," he replied, then added quietly, "You know, we all make mistakes. It's what we learn from them that matters." He didn't look up from his papers as he spoke, giving her the privacy to process his words. The elderly couple had dozed off, their hands clasped loosely between their seats. The tech guy was finally genuinely working, his fingers tapping rapidly on his keyboard. The cabin had found its rhythm, the earlier drama seemingly forgotten by most passengers. But Rachel felt each minute acutely, her routine tasks tinged with a new awareness. She found herself glancing at the cockpit more often than necessary, listening for Elijah's voice, wondering how someone could remain so professional after being treated with such unfounded suspicion. Rachel slipped into the rear galley during a quiet moment, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled slightly as she restocked the drink cart, ice cubes spilling across the metal surface. Each cube felt like another moment of that confrontation frozen in time. She thought about how Elijah had handled himself, his calm demeanor, his dignity in the face of her questioning. No raised voice, no angry demands to speak to her supervisor. Just that steady gaze and patient responses, even as she'd pushed and prodded, looking for a reason to justify her suspicions. "You okay?" Another flight attendant, Mark, asked as he squeezed past with an empty coffee pot. "You've been quiet since takeoff." Rachel focused on arranging the mini bottles of wine, buying time before responding. "Have you ever had one of those moments where you realize something about yourself that you really don't like?" Mark paused, leaning against the counter. "That thing with the pilot in 2A?" His voice was low, careful. "Yeah, word got around pretty quick." "I kept pushing," Rachel said, more to herself than to Mark. "Even after he showed me his boarding pass. Even after everything checked out. I just couldn't let it go." The words felt bitter in her mouth, like the aftertaste of something gone bad. Through the curtain, she could hear the usual mid-flight sounds, the hum of conversation, the clink of ice in glasses, the soft footsteps of passengers heading to the restroom. Normal sounds that somehow made her feel even more out of place. "You know what gets me?" she continued, straightening napkins that didn't need straightening. "He was just trying to read his book, take a break, after flying who knows how many hours. And instead of getting to relax, he had to deal with me. And now he's up there flying the plane." Mark filled the coffee pot at the galley's sink, letting her talk. The water rushing into the pot almost drowned out her next words. "I keep thinking about how many times this must happen to him. To others. How many times do people make assumptions, ask questions, make someone feel like they don't belong?" The beverage cart was as organized as it could possibly be now, but Rachel kept fidgeting with the items, needing something to do with her hands. Through the open cockpit door, she could hear Elijah's voice discussing weather patterns with Captain Stevens, calm and professional as ever. "My grandmother used to say that shame is useful only if it teaches you something," Mark offered, testing the coffee temperature with a practiced finger. "Otherwise, it's just dead weight." A call button chimed from economy, and Mark gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze before heading back to work. Rachel stood alone in the galley, his words mixing with the memories of her earlier actions. The shame wasn't just about what she'd done, it was about recognizing the assumptions that had led to those actions. She thought about her training, all those seminars about customer service and professional behavior. None of them had addressed the real issue, the silent biases that could make someone look at a perfectly legitimate passenger and see a problem that needed solving. The businessman who had witnessed everything walked past on his way to the restroom. He gave her a small nod, not unkind but knowing. Rachel wondered what he saw now, the flight attendant who had questioned the pilot, or someone struggling to face an uncomfortable truth about herself. In the cockpit, Elijah and Captain Stevens were discussing their kids, snippets of conversation about college applications and summer plans drifting back to where she stood. Such a normal, human conversation. How had she ever seen him as anything else? The descent into New York brought a flurry of activity that kept Rachel busy, but her mind remained fixed on what would happen after landing. She decided somewhere over Ohio that she needed to talk to Elijah, really talk to him, not just mumble a quick sorry and run away. The plane touched down smoothly, testament to the skill in the cockpit. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Rachel heard Elijah's voice one last time over the intercom, thanking everyone for their patience during the crew change. His tone was warm and professional, no hint of the earlier tension in first class. She waited by the forward galley, her heart beating faster than it should for someone with 6 years of flight experience. The other passengers filed past, the tech guy giving her an unreadable look, the elderly couple with their knowing glances, the businessman pausing briefly as if he wanted to say something before moving on. Finally, the cockpit door opened. Captain Stevens emerged first, looking tired but satisfied. He patted Rachel's shoulder as he passed, though she couldn't tell if it was forgiveness or just habit. Then Elijah appeared, his sweater slightly wrinkled from hours in the captain's chair, his book tucked under his arm. "Mr. Carter," Rachel said, her voice quieter than she'd intended. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Elijah paused, studying her face. The same steady gaze from earlier, but now she saw it differently, saw the patience and understanding that had always been there. He nodded, stepping aside to let the last few passengers pass. "I owe you an apology," Rachel began, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "What I did earlier, the way I questioned you, it was completely inappropriate. And I'm not just saying that because you turned out to be a pilot. Elijah listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. The empty plane around them felt like a confessional, the overhead bins still open like waiting ears. I made assumptions, Rachel continued, the words coming easier now. I looked at you and decided you didn't belong, without any real reason. And I kept pushing, even when I should have stopped. It happens more often than you might think, Elijah said finally, his voice gentle but firm. Not just on planes, not just to pilots. He shifted his book from one hand to the other. The question is, what do you do with that awareness? Rachel felt tears threatening to form but blinked them back. This wasn't about making herself feel better. I want to do better, she said simply. I need to do better. Then that's what matters, Elijah replied. He glanced at his watch, a simple timepiece. She noticed now, not the flashy status symbol she might have expected. I almost gave up flying in my first year. The constant questions, the double takes, the people assuming I was part of the cleaning crew. He wasn't saying it to make her feel worse, she realized. He was offering something, a perspective she needed to hear. What made you stay? She asked. A slight smile crossed his face. My first captain told me something I never forgot. He said, every time you step into that cockpit, you're not just flying a plane. You're changing what people think is possible. So I stayed. And today, I'm glad I did. The cleaning crew was starting to board, their voices echoing from the back of the plane. Elijah's phone buzzed, probably his ride home waiting at arrivals. Thank you, Rachel said, meaning more than just the conversation. For everything today. Take care, Rachel, he replied, heading toward the exit. He paused at the door, looking back. And remember, awareness is just the first step. It's what we do next that counts. Rachel sat in the crew lounge at JFK, waiting for her next flight. The events of the day played through her mind like a movie she couldn't stop watching. Around her, other flight attendants chatted about delays and difficult passengers, but she barely heard them. She pulled out her phone, opening the airline's employee portal. Elijah's words echoed in her mind as she scrolled through the upcoming training sessions. There it was, understanding unconscious bias in aviation. She'd seen it listed before, but had always found an excuse to skip it. Now, she clicked register, without hesitation. Laura stopped by her table, sliding a cup of coffee across the surface. Rough day? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. More like an eye-opening one, Rachel replied, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. I always thought I was good at my job. Professional. Fair. She stirred the coffee absently. Today showed me I had blind spots I didn't even know about. We all do, Laura said, sitting down. The trick is what you do once you see them. The terminal outside the lounge windows was busy with the usual evening rush. Rachel watched people hurrying to their gates, business people in suits, families with children, elderly couples helping each other with their bags. She found herself really looking at them now, wondering about their stories, their journeys. You know what gets me? Rachel said. He just wanted to read his book, take a break after flying halfway around the world. Instead, he had to deal with my assumptions. And then he still stepped up when we needed him. Word about what happened spread quickly among the crew members. But instead of the usual break room gossip, it sparked conversations. Real ones, about experiences and assumptions, about doing better and being better. A week later, Rachel was working another first-class cabin when she noticed a young woman in a hijab being questioned about her seat by another passenger. Without hesitation, Rachel stepped in, handling the situation with a new awareness she hadn't possessed before. She thought about Elijah sometimes, wondering if he was crossing the Pacific again, or maybe spending time with his college-bound daughter. His book, she'd finally looked it up, was on her nightstand now, a reminder of lessons learned in the most unexpected ways. The elderly woman with the pearls had written a letter to the airline, not to complain about Rachel's behavior, but to commend how the situation had been handled in the end. It's not about pretending these moments don't happen, she wrote. It's about what we learn from them. During her next crew briefing, Rachel spoke up about what had happened. Not to defend herself, but to share what she'd learned. The room was quiet as she talked about assumptions and awareness, about the importance of seeing people for who they are, not who we think they might be. Sometimes the hardest look is the one in the mirror, she told them. But it's also the most important one. The airline's newsletter featured a story about off-duty pilots helping in emergencies. There was Elijah, in his uniform this time, standing in front of a plane. The article didn't mention what had happened in first class that day. It didn't need to. The real story wasn't about one incident. It was about the changes that followed. Months later, Rachel still kept Elijah's words close. Awareness is just the first step. It's what we do next that counts. Every flight, every passenger, every interaction became a chance to prove she'd learned from that day. Not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever felt out of place, questioned, or unwelcome. The next time she saw someone reading The Shadow of the Wind on her flight, she smiled and kept walking. Sometimes the best service is simply letting people be who they are, where they are, without question or comment. It was a lesson learned at 30,000 feet, but one that would keep her grounded for years to come.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.